So when it comes to lifting weights, it's a totally safe activity, but you should learn how to do it, right? You wouldn't learn how to shoot a gun without learning gun safety, hopefully. So learn how to orient your body into the correct configuration so you can lift weights efficiently, and you'll notice that efficient is safe. So I'm going to go from head to toe on our model here, John Dowdy. He doesn't have to worry about this stuff. He's in his 20s, he can do anything. We'll talk about how to protect your spine, starting at the neck. So are you gonna get hurt turning your head to the side when you're holding a barbell in your hands or on your back? I mean, probably not, but it's better if when your spine is under load that you don't twist it, and that includes your cervical spine, which is your neck. So what I cue my trainees to do, John, if you wanna take the bar, is you don't need to look for the uprights. Just look straight ahead, walk it directly into the rack until you feel it touch the uprights, and then set it down. So there's no need to look around and helicopter as you're putting the weight back in the rack. On the bench press, don't use pressure from your head to help you hoist the barbell back up off your chest. If you see a trainee doing this, or you yourself notice yourself doing this, a way to fix it is just to cue the trainee to hover their head above the bench, or just have it so that their hair is just barely touching the bench. If you see your trainee pushing their head back against the bench press to push the barbell back up, they're putting too much stress on their cervical spine, which is a relatively delicate area. A straw man argument against the press implies that you might impinge your shoulder joint when you hoist the barbell overhead. But if you shrug, that certainly won't happen anatomically, and I'll show you exactly why that is. So John, go ahead and press the bar, and do it without shrugging. So notice his scapula's change angle completely. Go back down. Here's a scapula, and go back up. And it changes angle to create space in the joint for the bar to go overhead. And as he shrugs and tries to touch his biceps to his ears, it creates even more space in the joint, and everything is supported by his traps. For the upper body lifts, for the bench and the press, and actually for all the lifts in general, you want to think about having a hook connected to your sternum and lifting it towards the sky, because that will put your shoulder in an optimal position to avoid impingement overall. So chest up is something you want whenever you're lifting heavy weights, and that applies to the press, and it also applies to the bench. If you're noticing that you're getting some shoulder pain on the bench press, it might be that you're trying to place your back flat against the bench. You're creating an angle that is not ideal for shoulder health. So if you bring your chest up and you tuck your shoulders back and push your scapula flat against the bench, your shoulder will be in a more optimal position to move the weight. Another point on shoulder health on the bench, if you allow your elbows to flare out at the bottom past your wrist, you're putting your shoulder at a disadvantageous position, and you're creating an impingement that doesn't need to be there. So if you tuck your elbows just slightly to roughly the 70 degrees that we recommend, you'll notice that whatever shoulder pain you may have been having will likely be resolved. For the elbows, and this is actually something John does that I've got to cue him on because he's a young guy and it doesn't bother him yet. So press it overhead and then slam the thing down the way you do. So you see all the elastic energy that's occurring at the elbow joint. I'd rather you control the weight all the way down. So John, show us that with control. Yeah, so you want to lift heavy weights with control. You don't want to let go and let things kind of bounce off of your joints. That's not ideal in general. Will it hurt you? Probably not, but if you do it over the course of a 20, 30-year training career, that abuse might add up. So just lower the weight reasonably and under control as you descend out of the top of the press. Let's talk about the squat. This is the one that is actually fairly common. It's not common in starting strength gyms because you have a coach teaching you how to grip the barbell and hold it on your back. But for trainees that are learning this on their own, including myself, it's easy to misunderstand what we mean when we talk about the shelf for the low bar back squat. So why don't you go ahead and take your grip on the squat, John? And notice John has a narrow grip, and as he warms up, it'll become even more narrow. And the reason for that is so he can create this shelf of his posterior deltoids for the barbell to sit on, and that shelf is what's supposed to hold the barbell in all of its weight. He's supposed to grip the barbell with his back. He is not supporting the weight of the barbell with his hands, because if he does, that transmits into the elbows, and you will develop a nasty case of elbow pain if you're carrying the weight in your arms and not on your back on the squat. So this is critically important. To make sure John is carrying the weight on his back, I'm going to ensure a few things. So number one, squeeze my finger with your rhomboids, yep. And you can see the shelf become more pronounced, and lift your chest to your chin. And those are just two things that create more of a pronounced shelf, so the bar has something stable to sit on. And I'm gonna look for his hands. If I see that he's white knuckling the barbell, I'm gonna ask him to feather his grip. And if I see him cranking down on the bar as he drives out of the bottom of the squat, for example, I'm gonna ask him to feather the grip as he drives his butt up out of the bottom position. Equally as important is to make sure your lifters are not pushing into the bar. So the hands and the arms are there for support, but they are not there to carry the load. You must carry the load on your back if you want to maintain elbow health. This is a critically important one and a fairly common one that we see for trainees that are not being seen by a coach. So let's move to the low back. John, give us a side profile. This one is critically important. If you're going to lift heavy weights, you need to learn how to control your low back. John, show us your low back in flexion. So think of flexion like the cat back, rounded. Stand up straight. If you'll notice, John has a normal lordotic curve here in his lumbar spine. And you need to be able to hold that into position so that as you extend into the bottom of the squat and your hamstrings are pulling on the bottom of your pelvis, fighting for position of your hips, that your low back wins that fight and your low back doesn't round. Your spine should not be moving under heavy load. So the way you do that is you keep your head still when you're lifting weights, you keep your chest up and your thoracic engaged, and you keep your low back locked into normal anatomical extension. So John, go into flexion, and then show us how to lock your low back into extension. Good, so you'll notice that slight curve. And John, show us overextension. So for people with a bendy spine, this is especially for skinny men and for lots of women, it's possible to move your back into overextension, which is actually more dangerous than flexion. So don't confuse extension and overextension. You want a normal lordotic curve and you don't want to exaggerate it. If you have a flexible spine, if you're thin, if you're female, I recommend that you think about engaging your abs more so than trying to push your back into a position of extension. So John, fix that by engaging your abs. And you can see as soon as he locks in his abs, it pushes his low back into that normal lordotic curve. This is another great reason to wear a belt because the belt gives you proprioception, which means your abs have something to contract against. So when the belt is tight enough, you can contract your abs harder and you can support your spine better and ensure it doesn't go into a position of overextension. So next we'll talk about your hips. Your hips are a very robust joint and they're surrounded by a whole bunch of muscle mass. And that's why we focus all of our exercises around the hips and they kind of work their way inside out. So everything starts with the hips. And the things that I've seen are easy to avoid. So if your knees are sliding at the bottom of the squat, that might irritate your hips. Knee slide is when you fail to pin your knees by the midpoint of the descent and they slide forward at the bottom. The other thing is, and I've done this myself, is I over-exaggerated the knees out cue and I shoved my knees out further than my feet. Just think about aiming the inside of your kneecap at your big toe and that'll keep your knees in perfect alignment with your feet. The same thing applies if you allow your knees to cave into valgus. That can also irritate your hip joint. So knees in line with toes is the way to solve that and pinned into position by the midpoint of the descent. Squat with your hips and not with your knees because the hips are a more robust joint with more muscle mass surrounding them. And if you use hip drive, you'll be able to lift more weight, which will make you stronger. So there's just nothing but benefits when it comes to putting the bar a little lower on your back, bending over when you squat, and then staying bent over and driving your hips on the way up. If you split John's body in half from the side, notice what proportion of his legs are in front of the line and what proportion of his legs are behind the line based on his back angle. So John, demonstrate for us a back angle of a high bar squat. So take a line from the middle of his foot and draw it up. And look how much of his leg is in front of that line. And look how much of his leg is behind that line. So this is a knee dominant squat. This puts most of the load in the knee joint and on the knee tendons. Stand back up. Now bend over and do the prayer position squat to establish that back angle. This is how we teach people how to squat on day one, to teach them that bending over when you squat is what enables you to send all the load into your hips to facilitate hip drive, to put all the load in this big, robust joint with all the muscle mass that surrounds it. So now let's take a look at this line from the middle of his foot and see how much of his leg is in front of that. So look at the amount of load in his knees here versus how much of that is transferred back to the hips. So this is why we bend over when we squat. It is easier on the knees and it allows you to lift more weights because you can access more muscle mass. Now John, drive your hips up while staying bent over. Hip drive, that is the way we squat. So lifting weights is safe. You know, the injury rates are low. There are a couple of things to keep in mind when it comes to taking care of your joints. Make sure you're being prudent and diligent about teaching yourself how to lift heavy weights. If you're concerned about this or if you have to work around an injury, it might be worth hiring a coach. So you can get coaching from us anywhere in the world. It's onlinecoaching.startingstrengthgyms.com. And if you happen to live near a starting strength gym, just mention this video and you'll get a free 30-minute coaching session. Even if you don't end up training with us, we can dial in your form and teach you how to correct some of the mistakes that you might be making. Thank you.